In most cases, we hear people say, America has nuclear weapons, so Iran would have no choice but to surrender. True, America has aircraft carriers, submarines, stealth bombers, thousands of missiles, and of course, nuclear weapons. But could any of them actually force Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz? Don't forget to like the video and hit the subscribe button as we delve deeper into this. The question we ask is, if Iran refuses to open the Strait of Hormuz, does the United States have enough military power to force the strait open without using nuclear weapons? Or if conventional military force fails, would the United States actually use nuclear weapons to solve the Strait of Hormuz problem? So the answer is definitely not as simple as many people think it is. So the real question for the day is not simply whether America has enough firepower to force Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The real question is, can military power actually force open the Strait of Hormuz and keep it open safely? Question 1. Why did Iran close the strait in the first place? First of all, the Strait of Hormuz had been open to international shipping for decades, with vessels passing through the waterway freely. But that changed in February 2026, when the United States and its allies launched military operations against Iran, killing Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, members of his family, innocent civilians, and others. And among the most devastating incidents of the opening day of the war was the strike on the Shajara Tayyebi Girls Elementary School in Minab. The girls' school was struck on February 28, 2026, killing 168 children, most of them reported to be between the ages of 7 and 12 years of age. The scale of this tragedy was so staggering that more than 40 U.S. senators later wrote to the Department of Defense demanding answers and calling for an investigation into the strike. The senators specifically described the victims as mostly children. The United States initially said the incident was under investigation, but questions remained over responsibility surrounding the strike on the girls' school even till date. This matters because when we ask why Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, we cannot look at the strait in isolation. Iran closing the strait was not making its decisions in a vacuum. Its territory was under attack. Its military infrastructure had been targeted, and innocent civilians had been killed, including children at the Minab school. From Iran's perspective, this was an existential war imposed on them. And if Iran had been preparing for such a war with the United States and allies, the Strait of Hormuz was one of the most powerful strategic tools it had available. And this war gave Iran the opportunity to do exactly as they had wanted. The stated objective of this war by U.S. and its allies was to prevent Iran from building nuclear weapons. But anyone with a little knowledge about geopolitics in the region knew that if Iran came under an existential military attack, the Strait of Hormuz will certainly become one of its most powerful strategic weapons and bargaining power. More than 5 months into the war, the Strait of Hormuz has still not returned to the conditions that existed before the war, and Iran has made it clear that under no circumstances will the Strait of Hormuz return to the old status quo, which is free and safe passage for all. That era is gone. And now, because of the enormous economic damage caused by the disruption of Strait of Hormuz to the world, the priorities of American officials have increasingly shifted from preventing Iran from building nuclear weapons toward one immediate objective, which is reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If the strait was open and free for all before the war, what exactly did this war achieve? According to Iran, while the war continues, it will not allow ships to pass through this strategic waterway that could potentially be used to move military supplies to its enemies. From Tehran's point of view, allowing shipping to continue via the Strait of Hormuz, which sits directly off Iran's southern coastline, while the country is under attack, only means one thing: allowing the enemy and its allies use Iran's own route to be used against them. Whether you agree with that argument or not, this is the strategic logic behind Iran's position when it comes to their national security. And that brings us to the next question, question 2. Does Iran have the right to close the strait? Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLOS, the Strait of Hormuz is an international strait connecting the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the wider Arabian Sea, and Iran and Oman are the two coastal states bordering the waterway. Parts of the strait fall within the territorial seas of the two countries, Iran and Oman. They are the two coastal states bordering the Strait of Hormuz, and under international law, they both have territorial waters extending up to 12 nautical miles, or about 22.2 kilometers, from their respective coastlines. Please take note of this. The Strait of Hormuz itself is roughly 21 to 54 nautical miles wide, depending on where it is measured, with its narrowest areas being the most sensitive point of navigation. So because the Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 to 54 nautical miles wide, Iran and Oman's territorial waters can meet in the narrower parts. Together, their territorial waters extend up to 24 nautical miles, which is 12 nautical miles from Iran and 12 nautical miles from Oman, making 24 nautical miles. Now put the two sides together. Iran has 12 nautical miles of territorial sea, and Oman also has 12 nautical miles of territorial sea. Together, that is 24 nautical miles. But the Strait of Hormuz is also around 21 to 54 nautical miles wide, meaning that the point where the Strait of Hormuz is less than the 24 nautical miles wide, Iran's and Oman's territorial waters meet. So what happens is, Iran exercises sovereignty over its 12 nautical miles of territorial waters on the northern side of the Strait of Hormuz, and Oman also exercises sovereignty over its 12 nautical miles of territorial waters on the southern side of the Strait of Hormuz. But that does not mean either country simply owns the entire international passage and can freely decide which foreign ships can use it or not. Since the Strait of Hormuz is regarded as an international strait, that sovereignty is subject to international rules, including the right of transit passage for ships. That means ships and aircraft have rights to pass through such straits. Now, Iran and Oman are discussing an arrangement for managing shipping through the strait, with Iran overseeing incoming vessels and Oman overseeing outgoing vessels. While Iranian security authorities would have a role in the wider security arrangements, if such an arrangement is formally implemented, it would mean that ships will pass through the Strait of Hormuz under a new system of coordination and security controls, rather than returning to the completely unrestricted shipping conditions that existed before the war. In other words, the Strait of Hormuz could be technically open while still operating under restrictions that did not exist before the war started. This takes us to the next question. Question 3. What are the new rules Iran wants? Iran has stated that moving forward, ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz will have to coordinate with Iranian authorities, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, popularly known as the IRGC, and follow designated routes and security requirements. And then there is the question of money before passing the Strait of Hormuz, something which has never happened before. International law does not allow a coastal state to turn an international strait into a toll road and charge ships whatever it wants for the privilege of passing through. But you can receive payments for specific services rendered to the ships. So under this agreement, Iran frames any payment before passing the Strait of Hormuz as a security, or you can call it a safe passage fee. This payment will be presented as covering the cost of coordinating, protecting, and facilitating the safe movement of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. Whether such a payment would actually be lawful under the applicable international maritime rules would depend on the nature of the charge, how it is imposed, and the legal basis Iran relies on. But then the bigger issue will not be whether ships are allowed through or not. It is who decides which ships can pass, under what conditions, and at what cost. And if Iran is able to establish a system in which it controls inbound shipping while Oman manages outbound traffic, with Iranian security influence extending into the wider system, then the strait may technically be open, but it will no longer operate the way it did before the war. There are consequences for us all, and that takes us to the next question. Question 4. What is the global economic problem? The world economy cannot simply ignore the Strait of Hormuz. We've talked about its importance in our previous video. As we know by now, before the war, more than 100 million barrels of oil and petroleum products move through the wider Strait of Hormuz system every day. That represents a fifth of global petroleum consumption and makes the Strait of Hormuz one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. But with the conflict, that flow has totally collapsed. Today, only a fraction of the previous volume is moving through the strait, and with the U.S. blockade on Iran and other restrictions on Iranian exports, even less energy is reaching global markets from the region. The United States Secretary of Energy, Secretary Chris Wright, posted, quote, "Thanks to the coordinated efforts of the U.S. military and our Gulf allies, the 7-day average for oil leaving the Strait of Hormuz is currently up to almost 9 million barrels per day. When combined with the additional 5 to 7 million barrels per day leaving the region via newly upgraded pipelines and export facilities, total oil flows are currently averaging approximately 15 million barrels per day. On Sunday alone, over 20 million barrels left the Arabian Gulf region, which is above the pre-conflict average." Unquote. According to open-source data, these numbers given by Secretary Chris Wright doesn't match reality. Tanker Tracker, known mostly by tracking down oil shipments, replied to the Secretary's post, asking, quote, "Which 7 days are you basing this on?" Unquote. For now, markets can absorb some of the shock. Strategic reserves can be released, alternative routes can be used, and supplies can be redirected. But these things have limits because eventually the physical supply constraints will begin to show up in prices, and when energy becomes more expensive, the damage spreads far. Automatically, transportation becomes more expensive. Electricity becomes more expensive. Manufacturing costs rise. Food production becomes more expensive. Inflation increases, to mention but few. For Iran, they understand the power they have created. Their strategy is not necessarily to destroy the global economy. No, far from that, and they simply want to make the cost of continuing the war so high that its enemies eventually have to reconsider whether the war is really worth it. They believe the longer the war continues, the more expensive it becomes, not just for them, but for everyone else. Yeah, funny, right? And if the global economy eventually falls into recession, the political blame will not be limited to Iran. The United States will also face enormous pressure for starting the war. So after all these, we move to our next question. Question 5. What happens if Iran says no? Iran has currently linked reopening the Strait of Hormuz to national and security demands, and those demands are not simple, like, stop attacking us and we will reopen the strait. Nope. Their demands are much broader. Iran wants guarantees over its security, control over how shipping moves through the Strait of Hormuz, and conditions that would prevent its enemies from using the waterway against it. For the United States, accepting such terms amounts to recognizing a new reality in which Iran has far greater influence over one of the world's most important maritime choke points, and that would be a terrible deal from Washington's perspective. Well, if this is not good, then the alternative is seen as even worse. So the alternative is Iran will continue restricting shipping, and the world will continue losing access to huge quantities of energy that powers our economy. Looking at both, the choice becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Accept a deal that gives Iran greater influence over Hormuz for shipping to resume, or risk a prolonged closure that damages the global economy. Neither option is good, but in a situation like this, the question is not, which option is perfect? It is, which bad option causes the least damage? And from a purely economic perspective, even a partially restricted Strait of Hormuz may be preferable to a completely closed one. We move to the next question. Question 6. Will military option to force open the Strait of Hormuz? One will ask, why not simply use military force and reopen it? So the Strait of Hormuz is not a random place or a regular battlefield. The strait is a very narrow and an extremely sensitive waterway surrounded by military forces, coastal missile systems, drones, naval weapons, and other forms of asymmetric warfare. Iran does not need to defeat the entire United States military to win the war. It only needs to make commercial shipping dangerous and expensive enough that insurance companies, shipping companies, and captains decide, hey, we are not going through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran can easily use mines, missiles, drones, fast attack craft, and other weapons to threaten shipping around the strait, and no military option can destroy these weapons and allow shipping to resume in minutes. That is why, even though the United States has overwhelming military power, yet that firepower cannot automatically translate into a safe and open waterway. So if military option cannot reopen the strait, we ask our next question. Question 7. Will diplomatic option to open the Strait of Hormuz work? Factually speaking, if we want the Strait of Hormuz reopened even under Iran and Oman conditions, diplomacy is basically the only way because have seen this path work in the past. The war that started with Iran will never build a nuclear weapon anthem shouldn't have started in the first place. During Barack Obama's presidency, the United States reached the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the JCPOA, with Iran. The agreement involved Iran accepting significant restrictions on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. The deal was supported by the other major negotiating powers, including Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany, and the International Atomic Energy Agency played a central role in monitoring Iran's nuclear commitments. The agreement did not solve every problem between U.S. and Iran, but it demonstrated something important, which is diplomacy can produce limits on Iran's nuclear program without a war. Then what happened to the agreement? During Donald Trump's first presidency, the United States withdrew from the JCPOA. On May 8, 2018, President Trump announced that the United States would cease its participation in the nuclear agreement and ordered the process of reimposing U.S. sanctions that had been lifted or waived under the deal. The JCPOA agreement had been designed to place restrictions on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. But the United States walked away from the agreement and returned to a policy of maximum economic pressure on Iran. Iran, feeling betrayed and disappointed, expanded its nuclear activities. Under the JCPOA agreement, Iran's permitted uranium enrichment level was capped at 3.67%. After Donald Trump withdrew from the Obama agreement, Iran, in response to what Donald Trump did, started increasing its uranium enrichment, which under the agreement was capped at 3.67%. Now they have been able to reach 60%. That is still below weapons-grade enrichment, which generally understood to be around 90%. This does not mean Iran has built a nuclear weapon. It sends a message that Iran has developed the ability to produce highly enriched uranium that can be further enriched to weapons-grade levels if it made the decision to pursue a nuclear weapon. People ask, what happens if Iran eventually develops a credible nuclear deterrent after already demonstrating its ability to enrich uranium to levels far beyond the limits of the JCPOA? Would that make forcing Iran to reopen the strait even more difficult? And would the risk of a much larger war make military action against Iran far more dangerous? This takes us to the next question, question 8. Will Iran's nuclear deterrent be a threat? To me, this is perhaps the most dangerous possibility of all. If open-source reports circulating are true that Iran possesses a credible nuclear deterrent, forcing open the Strait of Hormuz with military force will become more difficult, because the United States would have to consider not only Iran's conventional military capabilities, but also the possibility of nuclear retaliation or escalation. A nuclear-armed Iran does not necessarily need to bomb the United States to become powerful. They simply need to make the consequences of attacking Iran with nuclear weapons highly unacceptable that Washington hesitates. That is the point of nuclear deterrence. And that brings us back to the question at the center of today's documentary. If military force cannot open the strait, and diplomacy remains the most realistic path to a lasting agreement, then another question becomes increasingly important. Question 9. Will nuclear weapons solve the Strait of Hormuz problem? Some people assume that if the United States used nuclear weapons, it can simply destroy Iran and force Iran to surrender. But that is wrong. Nuclear weapons do not solve every military problem. In fact, the use of nuclear weapons is a guarantee that the war is far from ending and will produce the opposite result: radiation, debris, environmental damage, damaged infrastructure, unexploded mines, regional escalation, and a very huge global consequences. Instead of making Strait of Hormuz safer, nuclear weapons will not only put the Strait of Hormuz in danger, but will make the entire region even more dangerous, which will eventually affect everyone. This is because once nuclear weapons enter this Iran-US war, the question is no longer simply, can we reopen the strait? It becomes, the Strait of Hormuz is closed and unusable. And suddenly, the Strait of Hormuz becomes more than just an energy choke point. It becomes a much larger nuclear crisis, which brings us back to our original question. Can nukes force Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz? A nuclear strike on Iran will destroy infrastructures, military bases, weapon systems, and other targets. But no military option can magically make a mine or a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz safe for commercial ships to pass through. In fact, using nuclear weapons on Iran will actually make the Strait of Hormuz even much more dangerous than it is today. A nuclear strike on Iran will definitely trigger an unprecedented regional escalation and turn a crisis over a narrow waterway into a much larger war. And that is exactly what we don't want to see, because the countries in this region that surrounds the Strait of Hormuz provide enormous amounts of energy, raw materials, and other resources that the world economy depends on. The real solution is not hidden inside a missile silo or aboard an aircraft carrier. It is sitting at a negotiating table. Because when the entire world depends on one narrow waterway, the most powerful outcome may ultimately be keeping that waterway open without firing another shot. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated.
Welcome to Open Source Intelligence Vault, investigating the stories behind global events.